guest interviews are back, my friends. I'm so excited. And today you are going to meet my friend Lucia Robinson-Griggs. So before we hop into the episode, I want to give you a quick intro bio to who Lucia is, aside from just the amazing human being that I got the chance to luckily meet in college and be friends with. So Lucia is the head women's basketball coach at MIT. And before she became the head coach, she was actually the assistant coach from 2011 to 2019. Then she left for a little while, was a head coach at Vassar, and is now back for the 2021 season. And so we talk a lot about her coaching experience in this episode. We talk a lot about her experience as a women's basketball coach at the college level, but we also talk about how that's played out in high school experiences, where she was a high school coach of a football team at a high school near me in Massachusetts. And so we talk about that. We talk about her experience of stepping into spaces where she is the first, only, and different, FOD. If you have read Elaine Welteroth's book, More Than Enough, you have seen that those three letters together before. And we talk about how important it is to acknowledge and honor the fact that being first, only, and different is a difficult hurdle, but also so important to witness yourself in that experience, but also watching and witnessing how that has influenced those around you and those around you that come after you, how they can step into a space where they can be first, only, and different. They can also embrace who they are even more than they did before. So representation matters. You hear that a lot, and I feel like in this particular episode, that is a huge theme of what we talk about here. Lucia and I also talk about how motherhood has shifted and changed the ability for people to really understand how she is stepping into her career fully, but also how it has also shifted and changed her relationship with her job, and how important it is to be bringing her children into the experience as well, and normalizing the fact that, yeah, your mom is a head women's basketball coach. And I also want to just say this thing, a little bit of prophecy here. I have a feeling that Lucia is going to go very far in her career. She's already gone so freaking far, and I was so excited. I remember when I got the news that she got the new gig, I was like covered in chills. I almost cried. Sometimes I do this, but I feel the excitement for other people. For sure felt that when I saw the news of Lucia's head coaching gig. And the person before her actually got a job as an NBA assistant coach. And so the National Basketball Association, for those of you that aren't sports people. For those of you that aren't sports people, I also want to just mention one thing about this particular episode. We are talking about the NIL in this, which is in relation to the NCAAs, which the NCAAs is the organization for college athletics. So for those of you that don't know, the NIL stands for name, image, and likeness, and there has been a debate for decades and decades and decades around the fact that organizations, schools, are benefiting off and profiting off of the hard work, influence, power, value of their college athletes, and what they're offering oftentimes is scholarship, but that doesn't necessarily always equate. And so there have been scandals, there have been a lot of stories about this in the past around collegiate athletes not necessarily getting the value back from the experience of them putting so much of their bodies and their skills and their talents on the line, to then also realize they have to get through college and hope that they're going to get to the professional level to see any level of reward back, even though they're putting all that value out there. And so Lucia and I dive into nuances of what the NIL means, the shift in the NIL. So this past summer, the rule has shifted that college athletes can actually benefit, profit off of, and leverage their name, image, and likeness in a way that we've never seen before. That rule is changing. And we're in a bit of a testing period, so we'll see how it plays out real time. So I'm excited for you to hear a little bit more about that, but I wanted to ensure I clarified what the NIL was. If you aren't familiar with sports, you're not familiar with the NCAAs. I grew up with a father who was a coach in the NCAA system for a very long time. I played Division II NCAA soccer, so I am familiar with it for sure, and so I just want to make sure that we don't just hop too far ahead in the conversation. Another thing I just want to make sure I talk about with regard to representation mattering, we talk a lot about the impact and the influence of Lucia being a coach, not just for her own experience and her own journey, but also how her athletes, the players on her team, can see a different version of what the prototypical coach has been, and how they might be able to either step into similar shoes, step into their own shoes, and step into the fact that they could be a coach in their own way as well. The power of her children witnessing her taking this space as a wonderful, wonderful head coach, and how that's powerful in just the normalization of this experience across the board. And then finally, we also talk about the fact that your family is so powerful and important as you're making these changes or you're making these moves into these other experiences. Being the first, only, and different has an additional weight, because if there's not other people that are looking like you or have had the same experiences as you might not be able to talk about things in the same kind of way that you would like to if you were in a group of peers that have shared experiences. And so we talk about the power of family. And I don't mean just biological family in this. I mean chosen family as well. And so Lucia and I dive into how important and how powerful it is to make space, make room, and honor your chosen family. Okay, before I give too much away, I am so excited for you to meet my friend Lucia. Welcome to Checkbox, other Lucia. I am so happy you're here. I am so excited for everyone to get to know you, because I feel like I gush about you when you're not in a room. And so now you get to be in the room and I can gush to you about you. So the first thing that I always have people do is give us a little Cliff Notes version of your journey. What are the ups, downs, aha moments, twists and turns that you feel like have led you to where you are today?
Well, thank you, Nikki, for having me on. Very excited to be a part of this podcast today. And just talking about my journey, I feel like it's been a forever, there's always like a what else around the corner of sort of coming out of college and figuring out like, oh yeah, math, finance. Yep, that's exactly what it's going to be. And then you kind of start down that path and you're like, ooh, this is not for me. And figuring out like I loved coaching summer camps and I love being a part of summer camps. So then I was like, oh, okay, well, I'll teach math and I'll coach basketball and I'll do this to like younger kids. And then I got a taste of coaching at the college level and it became like, okay, can I do this? And then it was still like the part-time teaching gig and coaching and just like always being like, okay, but I still like want something else. Like I still want something more. And can I go to this next step and next step? And then it was just kind of little opportunities and talking to people and networking, being like, hey, I think I might want to do this, and being willing to ask those questions and go out on limbs. And so it was the college opportunity. And then it became the college opportunity, but coaching full-time versus part-time and still teaching. And, you know, all of those kind of little mini steps got me my first, official head coaching gig. And, then got me to be able to have the opportunity to come back to MIT, which is where I'm at now and just where I felt so invested in a major, major part of that program. And so to have the opportunity to come back is just really, really incredible. And I just feel fortunate to be here and be in this position, and just all the little kind of steps and yeses along the way, and jumps of just jumping in and, not really worrying about what other people are thinking.
Yeah. And I mean, we both went to the same school. And so where we went to school had a very particular way of approaching your career that like you have to have it mapped out 5 to 10 years ahead. And to know all of, to know every step you're going to take is the way that you're quote unquote successful. And so, I mean, I feel like you and I share a very, very similar dynamic of like, actually, the places I found the most success are the ones that I didn't even know were coming.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's like, you've got to know. And it's like, well, why'd you go to Bentley just to teach math? And like, why did you do this one? I'm like, I don't know, but this is where I landed. And I loved my time at Bentley and I loved the experiences, but even the connections I made there, like they're, your friends for life and, some of the best people in it. And, kind of not to be completely cliched, because I also don't completely believe, but, everything happens for a reason. And, there's a reason you were in this place at that time. And whether it's a good experience or a bad experience, you're going to learn from it. And so, taking all of those steps along the way with you.
Yeah. And so much, I feel like, especially in interacting with people, both in the business world and personally, and even now kind of being in this wellness space that I work in, so much of what you learn isn't necessarily the stuff that's a bullet point on your resume. So like so much of being in interactions with folks that are going into different arenas than, math in high school. Yeah, that is something you're teaching in a whole different way than somebody that didn't go to Bentley to do so. And it's just like a whole different way of approaching the world rather than saying it needs to be one-to-one. So I don't know. I mean, again, I'm going to try not, I already feel myself getting all like hot and excited about this. So I'm going to keep it down for a minute. So, okay. So the question I love to ask people, and hence the name of the podcast, is can you share a time, or if you have more than one time, you're more than welcome, where you felt other or different and how that's kind of shaped your path and journey to where you are?
I've got a ton, and I feel like we always go down this rabbit hole of, and I just love like checkbox other, because I feel like even at being a mixed woman of color and just the anxiety that starts for when you are so little. And I remember like in elementary school filling out forms and it's, choose one, black, white, other. And you're just like, I don't know what to do. Like, and like, I remember being, a little like first, second, third grader walking up to my teacher being like, what do I do? And, they're like, just check other. I'm like, okay, but like, what does that mean? And just all of that of, if I check white, then I'm abandoning my black family. If I check black, I'm abandoning my white family. And I just think that that can happen in so many different arenas, like not just with race, but growing up and being a tomboy and being an athlete. And like, I couldn't, even at recess, I went to a very small Catholic school and I wasn't allowed to play with the boys. I needed a note from my doctor and from my parents to say that I could play with the boys. But then playing with the boys, I was not allowed to like go back and forth. Like if I committed to playing with the boys one day, like I couldn't go back with the girls. Like, and just being like, well, I like what the girls are playing, and
Right.
I like playing stickball with the boys and like doing other things. And so I just think there's so many little steps along the way where you're just trying to navigate and like you have no idea where you are. And it's not even so much yourself. If I feel like if I could have had the space to speak up and be like, I do like these things, but there's, the pressure from the outside of like, well, you can't, you have to be here or you have to be there. And there is no in between. And I think growing up and coming into my own space, that even now in my 30s, I'm feeling way more comfortable of being like, no, like this is who I am and this is where I want to be, and owning that space a little bit more than I would have maybe even only 5 or 10 years ago. Especially when it comes to the work world and being a part of the office and going into an interview or going into a meeting and being comfortable speaking up and being like, yeah, I think this is a great idea. Or like, no, I don't love this idea. And molding those different things instead of like being quiet. And so it just really working that other to my advantage of like, we can be a lot of different things. We can have a lot of different perspectives, and that's what's going to make us better, and not just going same old, same old. And you have to pick this box, or you have to pick that box, like blow them up and put them together and see what happens.
Yeah.
And so I just like have really grown into that space.
Yeah, it's so interesting because when I talk to people about this, a lot of times it comes back to like when you were a kid and you were like, wait, I came to the table knowing there were more than two choices and you're only giving me two, but like I can see them all. And you're teaching me I only can go through one or the other. And so the idea of like, I think there's a whole part of just the path that you and I live in our lives racially, because before us, there weren't many generations of people that look like us in spaces like we're in, right? So even if we're choosing one of the boxes, like there hasn't necessarily been somebody occupying the identity buckets that we have. And so no matter what, we're going to be blowing up the box. You can have me check whatever box you want, but like my lived experiences aren't going to fit them. And so it's so interesting as you're charting a new path and as you're creating something new, and also in a position of, leadership, especially as a coach, helping people grow into their potential and saying, it's not just this, you don't have to be this one person or this one person, or you don't have to be a guard in this way. There's a whole bunch of different ways you can do that. There are skills that you can learn. Here's where your potential shines. And I think as a coach, to be a really good coach, you have to be able to see the unique strengths in each person. But if you're only taking those unique strengths and mapping them to one model of how you play a game, it doesn't work. Just like in life, it doesn't work if you're like, you have to be this exact version because this is what a leader has looked like. This is what somebody who gets to speak up and propose a new idea in a meeting. This is what you have to do. And here's the path you have to take it. So I don't know if you know this, I'm sure you do, but like, I am here for, let's blow up the boxes, but also like, we can hold on to them as tight as we want, but just in the natural course of people stepping into positions to keep our society moving forward, they can't exist.
Yeah. And I think too, just even my own learning style, coaching style of being told, you have to do this a certain way, and players are not going to respect you unless you make them call you Coach Robinson, or now like Coach Robinson, like that's a mouthful. And so I just started being like, no, like call me Coach Lou, like that's fine. And I know like at the end of the day, like we're going to see eye to eye with each other. Like I am going to respect your input, you're going to respect mine, and it is what it is. And I don't think any less of a coach because my players call me Coach Lou versus calling someone else, Coach Smith or whatever the case is. Like, there is some fact behind that, maybe 20 years ago, but now I don't think that that's the case. And I think you've just seen it time and time again with different relationships and how impactful those are, or being told, like, almost the old teacher adage of like, don't let them see you smile until Christmas. And I'm like, that is so far from me. And like, just going into that, it was like, I wasn't happy. I'm sure my first players were not happy with me being like, who is this person? Like, and so now I just think like bringing more of my authentic self to who I am. And like, if that's not your on paper definition of a coach, then so be it. But like, why does it have to be that one path to success? I think you've seen it done in a multitude of different ways over time. And yeah, like there's not one little path, or like one being super serious and like you have to do everything this way and like there's no room for fun. Like, no, you can have it both ways.
Yeah. And no matter what you say, no matter what you call me, the issue, at least for a lot of these, of like, you need to call me by this name, is about respect, and it's about mutual respect and how we actually know how to work together to get to a common goal. So you can call me whatever name you want, but if you don't respect me, it doesn't matter what name you're calling me. If I don't respect
Exactly.
you, you can feel that without the language. So I wonder, especially because the way you started talking about like, I wanted, I still can't wrap my head around the fact that you had to get a doctor's note to play a game like at recess. Like what?
Yeah. Oh
Oh,
yeah.
so I know that you have, and I know that you have stepped into kind of non-traditional roles, especially in sports, as a woman in spaces that not necessarily women have been able to occupy space. So can you talk a little bit about what it was like to, one, be a player in the kind of first women's tackle football league here in Massachusetts? And well, you're not in Massachusetts, in Massachusetts. And also, I know you were a coach as well for a men's football team, or boys football team. I'm not sure what we call that, but can you talk a little bit about how that kind of transferred from that time as a kid being like, I want to play that game, to now being like, I want to play that game as an adult. Also, I want to coach, and I have a lot to bring to the table there.
I think entering the women's game of tackle football was completely transformative. Even playing at such a high level as a college athlete, I think you're going into a space where not many of those women like grew up playing tackle football or even flag football or even had some of those opportunities. There was a handful of women that maybe got to play pup water here and there, but it wasn't a sport that started at 6 and you rode all through college. And so to have different perspectives of so many athletes, like there were basketball players, rugby players, soccer players, volleyball players, like all coming together and just throwing into this sport that they were so passionate about, watching upon a time, a place, and having to learn the game, all the ins and outs, and learn different offenses, defenses, positions, body movements, even that you're not used to doing, was incredible. Because I think on some level, I definitely walked in being like, oh, I'm an athlete, I love football, like I've tossed around a football my whole life. And then those first couple of practices, when you're just like, you're seeing the dedication and the attention to detail, it's like, okay, like this is not a hobby. Like this is something that these women are putting themselves on the line for day in and day out. Like we all had day jobs, and then I was coaching basketball, coaching football, and then driving to wherever I needed to drive to practice from like 8 to 10 p.m. or 9 to 11 p.m. and wake up at 5 or 6 a.m. and do it all over again the next day. And and then you're traveling, whether you're taking like personal days or sick time and whatever, to travel on the weekends and make it to games. And it just was a really, really special experience to have, like just with this group of women. And I just think it's in a completely different space. Again, you're playing with moms, you're playing with career women that are suits by day, and then here they are at night in pads and the eye, and kind of going down that path and seeing, like, I think it's different even as a college athlete. Like that's part of like just what you do, and everyone's there like for that, but like that's also kind of like your job aside from studying in the classroom. But knowing that you have all these people from different walks of life, and we had women traveling from out of state, like just to be on this one team and kind of hustle and shed light on the sport, and for it to culminate the way that it did, even just this last weekend. Like there's still so much more to be done on the side of women's football, but the fact that Bob Kraft and the Patriots, flew out the Boston Renegades to Ohio for the Super Bowl, for the national championship. And
I
the
didn't
fact
know
that
that.
oh yeah, it was insane. I was teasing I like some of my old teammates being like, do you need a ball girl for this weekend? Like, how does that work? Yeah, so Bob Kraft like announced last week that he was flying them out, and it was incredible to just have that support from, your local organization that also is very storied and, has 6 championships, and now the Renegades just earned their 6th, so they won, and they got to leave behind a signed jersey of our quarterback Allison Cahill, who is like just head and shoulders one of the best athletes, and I mean quarterbacks in the game, but just one of the best athletes I've ever seen.
Mm.
Got to leave her jersey behind in the Hall of Fame. The team got to leave a signed ball like you know, in the actual Football Hall of Fame, which I think is just special to have that acknowledgement. And again, like there's still so many different avenues to explore and different exposures to be had, but that was a major step in the right direction. But just to see like what these women are able to do even part-time, and it's like imagine if that could be their career, of like your career is to just train day in and day out and to watch film and handle these sessions, and just like what they're doing already with everything else they're dealing with is truly special. And to even be a small part of that storied history holds a special place in my heart. And like watching the game this Saturday, I was like, jumping up and down and cheering, and I'm like home by myself. um but yeah, just that excitement, and to have been a part of that and still be connected to so many of the players is really great.
Yeah, it's also so interesting as you're saying this, thinking about how when people were entering this the first time, like they know football from watching football. I mean, you grow up in America, you can't avoid football, whether you like it or not. You know enough, you know some words, we'll say. But like, I know, I mean, you and I are both football fans, so like, you know it well. But also when you're saying there are people coming from multiple different sports, so there's just, I feel like thinking about the different, I mean, all the different sports you mentioned where people are coming together, there's so many different strategic strengths that people are bringing to the party to then make one whole team about a sport that you probably, gatekeepers are like, sorry, maybe you can play flag, but you can't really, we don't do this. And especially when you're likely at the peak in your physical ability as a college athlete, being like, no, that's not for you here. But when you're now being said, okay, let's split your life into multiple parts and now step into this role, learn the game in a new way, learn how to use your body in a new way, for sure. There's such an interesting part to being like, yeah, okay, I'm going to be able to do all these parts of my life at this high level, and I'm going to chart a path forward and represent for future generations. There's just like so many layers to everything that you just mentioned that I feel like represents so many aspects of people that are walking into spaces and saying, okay, well, there hasn't been a path for me before. I'm going to figure it out. And I'm going to find other people who are also like, well, there's nobody that stepped in my footsteps before. Let's come together and figure out a way so there's enough room for anybody else that comes next that hasn't had somebody that looks, acts, has the same background as them.
Yeah, or I think even with coaching, the high school team for a little bit. And I think some of that is just hopefully shifting their perspectives, as young boys, young men, and potentially future gatekeepers. So now like you are seeing more women coaches, or just women in the front office of NFL organizations, and women on the sidelines. And it just takes a little bit of that buy-in. Like I remember my first couple of practices, and like I might be correcting a movement or correcting like a route that somebody was running. And, I would see the player go and ask one of the male coaches, like, oh, did I do that right? Like, Coach Lou said to do blah, blah, blah. And they're like, yeah, that's right. And so it's like, and, it's like you take that with a grain of salt, but then, little by little, there's that buy-in. Little by little during a game, they're coming over to me to ask a question or ask advice, or like, hey, I'm having trouble with this. What do you see? What do you notice? And so, and then hopefully, when they graduate and they're getting into spaces with women, they're going to pivot and they're going to be willing to ask for advice, ask for different opinions. Whereas before, maybe they would have gravitated towards another male or someone with like a similar background, versus asking. And so just hopefully, that starts a shift of, okay, maybe I didn't play college football because I just couldn't, like that wasn't really an avenue for women, 15, 20 years ago, but now maybe it will be. Or now that doesn't necessarily mean that I know the game any less. Like there are elite players that know very little about the game in multiple sports, whereas, maybe there's the player that didn't play a lot but like they studied the game inside and out. And, that's, me, I was very good at cheering on the bench. Like, and, then translating that to being able to coach and understand the game and notice like little nuances. And so I just think now, especially with numbers and analytics, there's a little bit more value for some of those experiences and not just plucking like the most elite athlete and, assuming that they have the persona and the capabilities to be a great coach. Not saying that it can't happen, because it surely does, but I think being an elite player doesn't automatically qualify you as like that you're going to be a great coach.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting because I was just thinking as you were saying that, I don't even know how many years ago this was, because, time is not really a real thing lately. I went to a women's leadership conference and they were talking about having more women coaches in the NFL and the impact. It wasn't just, okay, you can trust that woman is coming to the game, knowing all of things, but also the fact that so many of the elite coaches that had been around for a long time were realizing like, actually, it's not that I just want this person to now be like everybody else that I've worked with, that there is a level of comfort about things that might not have been okay with coaches in the past that were male, that you wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable talking about certain things, but also you have the ability to bring this person into the space that has the skill and the caliber and the knowledge, but also brings in a different dimension to what coaching is able to bring. Because when you're on a team, especially at those levels, like this is your family, this is your life, this is so much of what you're doing, that it was such an interesting conversation to be actually talking about the fact that like, I don't want you as a female coach to become just like a male coach. I want you to be who you are, because when you show up as who you are, you actually open a whole nother arena for us to be able to support the members of our team. And so I thought that was really interesting. And then as you're saying, coaches, I mean, there are so many coaches that never really played, but we don't talk about that. Yeah. We're just like, oh yeah, you were born into coaching, so that's normal. It's like, okay, yeah. So that's so interesting. Okay, well, since I want to go so many places, but I want to hear from you, because I know as the last like couple of years have gone by, there's been so many things to navigate as a coach in a college space, because of students having to go through like being at school, not being at school, knowing how they're going to, especially if you're going to school with the goal of being able to play, with your seasons kind of being in flux and in limbo. How do you feel like the ability to kind of bring sports into the mix of uncertainty has given people an outlet, one, to feel grounded in something, but also two, I think we've seen a lot of social justice work coming through the cohesion of working and collaborating as a team. So how do you see, or how have you seen, especially with the people you're coaching, the ability to kind of come together in uncertainty to challenge things that aren't right, but also to ground when you're feeling a little bit all over the place?
I think it's forced us to really take a look and acknowledge our culture pieces, but then who we are as coaches and what we're willing. I think you'll find a lot of coaches that tend to be, I feel like a culture piece a lot is like your team is your family, and that's who you are. But then kind of like when push comes to shove, it's like, I'm uncomfortable, I don't really want to talk about that. And so then it's just kind of like, okay, but then what are we perpetuating as we move forward? And as we have these players that come from all across the country, or all across the world, and they're leaving their own families, and we're saying like, this is your new family. I think you need to be able to broaden your own horizons as a coach and learn what is happening, hear from your players and their perspective, and be able to have those tough conversations, and not just shut down and be like, oh, I'm your basketball coach, I'm your lacrosse coach, I'm your tennis coach, like I don't want to talk about that, or like pawn it off to like an assistant or a graduate assistant or something like that. And I just think it's forced you, or myself, I know as a coach, to be a little more vulnerable in the sense of like sharing some of my experiences when it comes to like social justice or things that I've faced in the past. And because I think sometimes too, like your players, whether accurate or not, sometimes they just like hold you up on a pedestal and like, you're the coach, you're this and you're that. And being able to just sit down with them in a neutral space and be like, hey, I've been through this, and tell me, share your experiences, like how are you feeling, how are you thinking, and just giving that safe space. Because I think a lot of times players just want to feel that connection, and like they don't know how to even start some of those conversations or how to look at those conversations. And so I know in my time at Vassar, when really at the height of this movement, and being able to talk about some of these issues, we really threw ourselves into the education piece of educating ourselves. But then we did like a 3 week long kind of information session almost on our social media, and just like rolled out, and people did different takeovers. And I know the MIT team as well, which, going back to, this has been something that we've talked about in the interview process. And then now this summer, kind of getting back into, hey, what's important to you? As I'm coming in and I'm coming back and taking over, what's important to you? And social justice was one of the things we talked about. And, kneeling for the anthem, like, where do you land on that? How do you feel about that? And one of the things that I brought up was like, that's kind of been done before. And I think we're at MIT. So what can we do that's different? Or how can we put our own stamp on this, of not just like kneeling, but can we draft a statement? Can we do this? And I think the players are really invested in that experience, and sort of acknowledging either past wrongs, or whether it's personal or just societal,
Yeah.
and saying like, okay, like, yeah, we need to look at this and we need to figure this out. And I just think our players overall, being at MIT and just changing and influencing the world, like this is one area where they are ready to speak up. And so I'm happy to like lead them into that next era of like, okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to be outspoken, and put our own stamp on this? Because I think it's important. And even, recruiting, and for younger players, like this is stuff that matters to them, and their influence on the world as they're graduating, as they're going into jobs, like they're looking at companies and, weighing like, hey, what's your social justice policy? What's this? And those are things that they're starting to ask in interview processes, and things that they're looking at before they commit to a company for working. Whereas, 10 years ago, was that even, really on your mind as you're going through a job interview? Probably not. And so like, that's just one thing. It's like, okay, this is going to be a part of our lives, and we want to be on the right side of history. And so how can we grow in this together?
Yeah, it's so, it's so interesting, because I feel like a lot of times I talk a lot in the work that I do about the generational shift, and how like we've got a huge, millennials are in the workforce and are now getting into management positions, leadership positions. And you've got the Gen Z population that are the folks that were literally just walking out of school being like, yeah, no, I'm not doing this. Like it's just, I've been having, there's been conversations about gun reform in school since I was in school. So let's talk about that. Like just the fact that there is an open dialogue about things that we as kids were told, shh, we don't talk about that. That's for later, or that's for home, or literally like you'd feel it, right? So you'd feel it from your teacher, whether they said it or not. You don't talk about those things. And so it's so interesting to think about the fact that the whole line of like kind of shut up and dribble, how you've been told as an athlete, this is your job and this is your lane, stay in that lane. And how it's like, yeah, no, that doesn't fit either. So I'm going to talk about my things, and I'm also going to realize my position of power, and also the collective power of my team. And we can come together and think about it differently, because if we just keep doing what's been done generation over generation over generation, we're going to end up in the same spot. Maybe like an inch further, but we've got miles to go. So how can we say, okay, thanks so much. I understand and I will learn from the past, but also what are ways that I can take what I know and have learned, because I've been exposed to so much from a very young age. The level of just transparency that the internet has brought, now this sounds like so weird to say, but like, so I have my brother's youngest brother's 15 years younger than me. And the thought of, what he has known at such an early age. So he's having conversations with me that he's 20 now. So at 20, sure, I was having them, but I didn't have the level of depth and knowledge and transparency through the whole process to be able to see through I always talk about it as like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, that we didn't necessarily know existed because we weren't even allowed to go close to see the curtain in the first place. And so it is such an interesting thing to have this younger population of people that are like, I'm making a decision to come to this school, not just because I'll play, not just because I'm going to go to MIT and like have a badass degree and come out of here and be able to change the world, but I want to be able to use my time in this space to combine all of those things to move us leaps and bounds forward, and to be a coach that's like, yes, is a game changer.
Right. And I think, before, same, like maybe in college we were having some of these conversations, but it was always like stay in your lane. Here's what you do. Like, you don't take action. Whereas, like now college students are like, we're going to have this conversation and there better be action to back it up. And I think I just recently read Abby Wambach's Wolfpack.
Yes.
And like just her, one of her rules, which was like, be grateful and ambitious, because like we're always told to just be grateful for being in this space. Be grateful that you have a seat at the table. Like as a woman, oh, be grateful that you're allowed to play this sport, Title IX, like, and all of that. And then it's like, well, I am going to be grateful, but I want more. Like, I'm going to speak up. This is not okay. And like, I'm going to use my platform, and like, yeah, I'm grateful to be here, but I'm going to take it a step further. And I don't know if, in the past we would have had that comfort or just that confidence to be like, yep, I'm going to ask for more. And like, this is what I can do with my platform.
Yeah. The yes. And so Abby Wambach's Wolfpack, the idea of gratitude is so interesting to me, because the idea that we are supposed to be happy with the work towards equity and not necessarily the work towards justice. We should be happy with the progress that's been made when we see how far it can go. I think it is it feels like a pat on the head. It's like, oh, look how far and you're like, keep that pat to yourself. I'm good. I'm going to keep moving forward. So I think that's so interesting. And also I think, as you were saying, how people look to you as a coach, where you're like, I'm a person, you're a person, but also I'm your coach. But like for you to be able to model that just by being, not making a huge deal about who you are, just being like, hey, we're going to talk about this because it's a normal thing and it's important, shows that like, okay, I can go into my school, I can go into my dorm room with new people I haven't met before. I can go to the dinner table at home and talk about things because I've had a space that I might not have had in my life to be able to actually practice saying these things out loud and be with other people that may challenge me, but also then get on the court with me and play. And so we don't necessarily all have to be exactly the same in order to kind of create a future that's better than what we have today.
Yeah. And that's a huge part of it, of like, diversity and all of that speak, and like, oh, we need to be diverse and blah, blah, blah. But like, I think it's also not just diversity in looks, but diversity in ideas of different perspectives. And, maybe I grew up in one part of the country, you grew up in another part of the country, and just things were different doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad, but being able to come together and share those ideas and come to another solution and, blend those ideas is what's going to move us forward at the end of the day. And sort of everyone staying in their comfortable silos is not going to get us to where we want to be.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so funny because growing up for me, so my father's from Haiti, came here, and most of the people that I knew as his friends growing up were not from America either. And so it was so interesting because I grew up in Connecticut, where pretty much everyone that I grew up with was very American, we'll say, and very white. It was very white centered, but also to have this experience growing up with all these people coming from like vastly different places, vastly different, just like languages, like baseline, speaking different languages, but having the language of sport to bring you together and having that shared experience of a love of a game to be able to bridge even like, these guys, I remember being a kid and being like, they were just fighting on the sidelines and now they're out here like scoring goals, getting so excited. What just happened? I thought conflict was, how does that bridge that gap? And so how sports has such a wonderful way to kind of help us overcome the things that we aren't necessarily. I mean, if anything, in the last 5 years, we've seen over and over again how our society hasn't really been taught to have productive conversations around conflict and disagreement. And I do feel as though like one of the things that I hope I'll do some episode on is like, I feel like the whole time I was like, so a lot of these people have never experienced losing before, because if you played sports most of your life, you learn what it is to lose, and losing gracefully to a certain extent, and knowing that the world doesn't revolve around you. You have to be able to, look like an asshole. You have to be able to like make a mistake. You have to be able to have somebody that's better than you at something and beats you at something. And I feel like what we've been witnessing in the world, whether you've had that experience or not, it's like that whole idea of we don't smile, we don't allow ourselves to crack, we don't allow ourselves to have vulnerability. It's like the only way for us to move forward in any kind of way where we get to coexist is that we understand like we're not all the best and we're not all certain and right all the time. But so often we don't have enough of a playground that it's safe enough to stumble and fall, to like make a misstep where there are people on your team that might not necessarily believe all the same things. Because I think that's where we get in that kind of group think where it's like, you're on my team only if everything I say you nod to and everything you say I nod to. And the idea is like, I can actually be in community with and support someone that I don't agree with. Again, like, I just feel like on all the levels we're talking about, of being able to take up space with your body in a country that has a lot of people that are different, like your body is a threat, but to be able to do that, bring your academic knowledge that you're bringing to the party. And I know when we were talking, you're like, some of these people are going to be like astronauts. They're at NASA. They're like literally changing the game outside of our world. Being able to bring that to the perspective, and then to have interpersonal relationships that might be different from anything you've experienced in your life because you're in a new environment. Like, just the layers of that and the depth with which you can actually come out of school a much more, I guess, more complex and nuanced human being that can then amplify that outside of, the walls of MIT. I think it's pretty freaking amazing.
Yeah, I mean, just college in and of itself is a major transformative time, like in anyone's life. And,
Yeah.
add to that some of the coursework and opportunities that our students have at MIT. And then on the flip side of that, they're choosing to dedicate so much time and energy to playing a sport they love at an elite level. Like, there's just so many layers that they're constantly learning and growing from, and that are shaping them on and off the court. Maybe a conflict or something that happened on the court is going to help them when they go into their group work and they're in their lab. And or maybe just, again, a lot of these women that may go into male dominated fields, but being an athlete and being able to have that discourse, with coaches, with their teammates,
Yeah.
may give them a little more of that courage to go speak up in a lab and be like, I actually, I think our calculation needs work, or I think, this needs work. And being able to just like advocate for themselves, I think, is such a great experience for them to have, in both ways. And the same, like, maybe, some things that we've done in the course of a season has been brought back from a player from an internship, or from some job experience that they had over the summer, or winter break, spring break, and they come back and they have a new idea. And it's so just that encouraging the sharing of ideas, and being able to put some of that into action, I think, is only going to help us be better and kind of get to that next level where we're like knocking on the door of right now.
Yeah. It's so interesting because, as you're saying, the idea that again, this is my like women's leadership brain is like, yeah, because so often the historical data that you're told as a woman going into male dominated spaces is that you're going to have to work so hard for anybody to at least hear your contribution, let alone have that contribution be practiced and seen if it actually works. And so to be able to be bringing that both from the workplace back into the arena where you're literally like used to trying new things out and trying to practice this stuff, and watching that your idea actually transformed the process and the path that your team is on. It's a level of, so much when I'm working with clients, I'm like, so much of this is just watching yourself doing it, witnessing yourself do something that like you kind of knew you could do, but you haven't actually had the opportunity to do it. Or like, I always talk about it as like building a muscle. Like, the muscle's there, but you've never had the opportunity to tone it and get it, make it stronger, because you're walking up to, you can't lift 2 pounds, but they're like, in order for you to do this, pick up 150. And you're like, I haven't used the muscle before. And this guy's been picking up 150 pounds for 10 years. What do you mean? And his dad did that before that and that. So it's just, yeah, it's really cool. I didn't even think about that. Okay. So I would love your take on how, as we see more women in leadership positions, especially in sports, as coaches in sports, how you kind of see the narrative around women coaches, how that has, one, moved us forward in a good way, but also I think that we tend to fall into silos of ways we talk about women as coaches. So where do you think like it's moved really well forward? And then in other ways, like where is there, like, if you could shine the light in a different way and say, okay, how about we talk about this differently than we're talking about this now? How would you kind of approach that conversation? If you were like, give me the microphone on that news, ESPN, give me the mic, let's do this. Yeah.
I think it's just the continued narrative of like, we're seeing so many firsts, first woman this, first woman of color, first, and just for that to continue to become the norm, where it's like not the first, or it's not a novelty, and it literally is like just the best person for the job, of not, oh, we have 3 finalists and one's a woman, like, oh my goodness, like, and at any level. And, a lot has been talking this off season in the NBA of Becky Hammond, and, how ready she is to be a head coach. And it's just going to take that one organization to step up and make it happen. It's one thing to hire a woman in the front office or hire a woman as an assistant, and to give her legitimate roles aside from being a glorified runner or like personal assistant, but to give them real roles. And I think you're seeing a lot of that happen. And so just a lot of that is that narrative without it being a novelty of like, oh my goodness, she had a really good scout. Like, well, were you surprised? Like, like she did the job, like she went through the process, she was hired, and yeah, her scout was awesome. Or, yes, oh, she could talk to the players. Like, yeah, that's all part of it. And so I just think that novelty needs to start to wear off. And
Yeah.
I think you're seeing it with the people that are in there, or when players sometimes have been interviewed, and it's that question of, oh, what is it like to be coached by a female? And do you see it any different in the locker room? And I think it's your Monday morning quarterbacks that love to frame that narrative, but a lot of the people, the ones that are inside of the locker room, are just like, no, that's coach. Like,
Yeah.
She tells us to do something, we do it. Like, we trust her perspective, we honor her perspective. And I just think it's like that with any sport. You have your keyboard warriors and all of that don't really understand what goes on, or maybe they haven't competed at an elite level. And it's easy to pull the pieces from behind the keyboard, but you go into the locker room, or that feeling of like, there's 8 seconds left in a game and you call a timeout, and that feeling of being in the huddle, like it's very easy to watch and say like, oh, I would do this, 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 and this. But it's like when all lights are on you and you have all these eyes, it's like, it takes a little bit to get used to. And so I'm just ready. I don't know like if there's any kind of one switch or one magic word, but it just is literally going to just take away the novelty of it, and more women being involved and seeing some successes, and not necessarily being captive again with the Becky Hammon. And is she ready to be an NBA head coach? By her resume, sure, but is she probably going to be passed over a couple more times for people that have been head coaches before and never won anything? You're probably going to see that for another couple of years. I mean, I hope we don't, but
Yeah.
it just it's going to take that one time, and it's going to take that little bit of successes, because God forbid she loses a game and doesn't go undefeated, then people are going to be out there like ready to say anything and everything of, she wasn't ready, men can't play for a woman, and you're going to have all of those naysayers. And it's going to have nothing to do with,
right, like no guy coach has ever lost a game before.
exactly.
Yeah.
But and it's so silly, especially just being an athlete. Like, if you're good, you're good. If you know the sport, you know the sport. Like, it has nothing to do with your gender. And that's it. The novelty has to start to wear away, which hopefully, and I think you're starting to see a little bit of it, even just with NBA players and more men supporting the WNBA.
Yeah.
Of like, hey, these women can play. And now it's just not as much of that novelty idea of like, oh my goodness, let's see what happens. And
Right.
but yeah, so I'm just ready for that shift. And I think it's just going to open a lot more doors and opportunities. I think women are lacking anyway in coaching, even on the women's side.
For sure.
There's not as many female coaches. And so I just think when more doors open, more women are seeing successes. And it's just when it becomes more accessible to women, moms, people that have families, I think you're going to just see a lot more doors open, and you're going to see a lot more women in the game.
Yeah. It's so interesting because as you're saying this, I'm like, yeah, it's funny to think, and it's not funny. We live it, breathe it all day, but to think that we base so much on identity for the ability to do something rather than to actually witness the ability to do something, that we are first going to put it through the pass of what do I see and what do I know about who you are versus what do I know about what you've produced or what you've been able to do in the role, and how the ability to have so many different representative human beings stepping into these positions actually releases the tension for every person that's in there. That is like, hey, if you're going to do it differently, do it differently. And it doesn't have to be based on one particular element of your identity. Unfortunately, again, we are tribal beings by nature. But I'm so intrigued to hear kind of how I was just even I know when I was sending this to you before about how just like normalizing the fact that the coach of Arizona was pumping at halftime. Yep. But did she do what she needed to do? Yeah. Did they do well? Sure. We're okay to be full on human beings and still do our jobs, just like in so many other aspects of our lives. When we were talking about the women that were playing on the Renegades with you, where you were having to juggle like 5 different identities and you're still doing them all well. Why does it have to be that I have to, get to the front of the line and yell about how I'm different for that to be an okay way for me to do the job if I'm able to do the job well?
Yeah. And even for Adia Barnes to say so much of what she did, there was a really great article in The Athletic of her talking about um, being a mom and being in a position where, she was free enough to say some of those things, but then, looking back at maybe the new mom that's an assistant somewhere or a second assistant and like just barely has their foot in the door and they don't want to ask for too much because they're still trying to climb the ladder, and
Yeah.
what that kind of does to your psyche, or why women tend to take time away. But then obviously in any career you take time away and it's like, oh, what's this gap in your resume? Why did you take time off? And
Yeah.
what skills are you lacking now that you took time off? And even as a mom and thinking of some of the struggles that I had, like keeping up with things or not even having a place to pump. And, technically you're supposed to when you're working, but that
Right.
wasn't always the case. And,
Yeah.
and little things like that, or being looked down upon for having to go pump because I'm taking a break. And it's like, oh, well, I'm still correcting papers. I'm still like
Right.
responding to emails and like doing these things. And I think even just the shift of the whole office life, which I think one of the positives coming out of COVID is like we realize that we can work from home, we can be productive. And I have a very forward facing job, and being a coach, like I can't do that from home all the time. But I just think the anecdotal of like, oh, Nikki always the first one in the office, last one to leave. And I think that that's a dangerous sort of label to put on people, because okay, maybe I'm leaving the school building at 3 o'clock because I've got to go pick up my own children, but you don't see me finishing correcting papers and my lesson plan, at 2 or 3 a.m.
Yeah.
after I've done, dinner and bedtime and bath time with the kids, and, spent time with, my husband, partner, like whoever. Like you don't see that, but because you don't see it, I'm not doing it.
Right.
And
Right.
I'm not as efficient at my job.
Yeah.
And I just think that that's kind of a scary label. And it's even a rat race that I always fell into of
Yeah.
like having to get there early and make sure people see me.
Yeah.
So they know
FaceTime.
I'm around, so they know I'm doing things. Even though again, like you don't see me when, I go home and I'm up and I'm doing these things and keeping up and making sure that I'm ready to go. But like to what extent, or like at what detriment to like my own mental health of pushing these things. And so even just for her to like speak up about what it is being a mom. And even when I first had my first child at MIT, and when sort of Sonia gave me the freedom of like, hey, bring Kai to practice, like,
Yeah.
bring her to this meeting. And, and I'd be like, are you sure? Like, she's still a baby. Like, and it was like, yes, because on the flip side of that, it was, which like now I'm starting to see, but at the time, of course, like my anxiety would shoot through the roof of like, oh my God, well, what if she cries? What if she does this? Like, what if I need to change her? Like,
yeah.
and all of those other things. But then it was just like, no, like it's good for the players to see that like you can coach and do something you love, and you can raise a family, and like getting to see like your support system and all the ins and outs and like little behind the scenes things that go to making this a reality for me and being able to coach. Like it's good for the team to see that, and they don't necessarily feel like sort of breaking that of like you don't have to be one or the other. Like
Right.
you can have it all. It's gonna take a lot of work and a lot of support, but
Yeah.
it's possible. And so kind of in hindsight, I think that that's something I've appreciated, and also just look to move forward of like, yeah, hey, you know what, like, yeah, babysitter canceled, kids at practice today,
Come
but
on.
we're gonna make it work. Like practice is not gonna be any different. It's not gonna be, any lighter, or I'm not less driven in my career now because I have children. And so I just think her putting so much of that out there in her article of like just the balance, and not even balance, I don't think it's ever really balanced, but just like how they're going to work together and complement each other. And it's going to ebb and flow. Like there's going to be some days where maybe you're coming into the office a little bit later because you're handling kids drop offs because I know we have a game that night and I know I'm not going to see them. So I'm going to try to spend a little more time in the morning or,
Yeah.
vice versa, whatever that looks like. And I just think it's important to have those messages out there and to have those supports and just see just that representation is so important of like someone in a position of power to say that and have it trickle down.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's, as you're saying, like the gift that you're giving without even knowing you're giving it by just showcasing what's happening in real life. There's been so much that happens behind the scenes and so much that happens behind the scenes for us all to be able to do what we do, but we've been told this is the only version of yourself that's acceptable in the public eye. And the ability to showcase, like, actually to make this happen. If you're only seeing a sliver, you think it's super easy to do all this. But if I'm able to show you, like, there are all these dynamics that make this engine run the way it needs to run, this engine of my life move forward in the way it needs to. And sometimes I need to fuel it a little differently. Sometimes I need to do something else a little differently. Sometimes you might have to adjust a little bit, but we're all going to get to the end goal that we need to get to. And I think that also comes back to the whole idea when you were saying, like, having the student athletes come back and bring things that they've learned from other places to then contribute to how to make something more efficient and effective within the organization that you're running together, that you're in together, is such a wonderful gift for you, for them. And I also think, for Kaya to be able to just have that experience of just being like, oh yeah, this is what my mom does. Also, I'm part of this. This is really cool. Look at all these badass women that are doing all this great work. Like, here's what it is to just exist in this world. They don't have to be completely separate from each other. We don't have to be, again, like we were saying before, the boys and the girls can play sports together. Wow, that's amazing. These things don't have to be separate from each other to exist. And it's just, we can say the words like we were talking about before about how, like, we talk a lot about diversity, we talk a lot about equity and inclusion, but talk is cheap unless you're actually witnessing how it's playing out and you're actually having the opportunity to see it modeled and to watch yourself do it. It makes a completely different ballgame. It makes a completely different trajectory into the future. So you're not going backwards to then go forwards.
Yeah. And I mean, I just think even going back to kind of just you're being your authentic self when you are like in this environment and you're not some like big coach on a pedestal. Like, I've had players that have come back and even just like felt okay enough in our relationship to ask, like, I don't know if I want kids. Like, how did you know you wanted? And, having just like being able to have that discussion, but also kind of like feeling good of, okay, this player trusts me enough to like come back and ask that question. And like, being a parent is not necessarily for everyone. And like, it takes a lot to make that happen and, chase the career that you want, but, it's possible. And just having those relationships and being able to help them navigate their lives, beyond graduation, I just think is one of the most special things as a coach. And some of the things that you may not even realize, something you said 8 years ago that sticks with a player and, they'll come back on an alumni day and they're like, oh, remember what you said? And I'm like, no, but and I just think, again, like that representation, that modeling is so important. And I think it's only going to make us stronger in the end of, just the teams that are able to come together and have those difficult conversations. And they're the ones that are going to be able to get over that peak of, you can only get so far. And there's been so many teams that kind of make it, almost all the way to the mountaintop, but they don't quite finish. And, maybe they never, brought home that championship or, brought home this or brought home that accolade. And, I think if you really did a deep dive into like their culture or how things were going behind the scenes, like it's going to be, it almost always is going to be a culture piece. It's not going to be, something that maybe they just couldn't figure out,
how many sprints they did at the end of practice. Yeah.
Right. Like maybe, maybe it's not gonna, maybe it could have been a little something X's and O's. And of course, there's talent that plays a factor, but I think, when you get there and like you're at that round, like there's always like something in that trust piece of, did you trust your teammate enough to make that extra pass? Like, did you trust to run that play, or did you second guess it and you didn't really do it? And so I just think that that's something when we're playing, when we finally get to where we want to get to be playing and like we're, in a championship round, I don't want culture to be a reason why we don't. Like if we miss a shot, if we're just, maybe not the most talented, but if our X's and O's are good and that culture piece was there, like I just don't want that to be a reason we lose. And
Right.
then it's like, okay, we've got to re-examine what we're doing and make sure that we're all on the same page, which I think is a healthy checkup anyway for any team of, just reevaluating who you are and where you want to go, and not sort of just like, oh, okay, we came up with this like 15 years ago and let's just keep it moving. Like,
Yeah. Churn and burn.
It's always, yeah, exactly.
So I'd love your take on the new NCAA rules and how you think that's going to play out. I know it's a big topic of conversation across all divisions. How do you see that playing out and impacting your role as a coach, and I guess recruiting specifically too, but also the kind of lives of the women that are coming into your program, and how that kind of shapes just the landscape of college sports in general?
I'll be honest, I'm shifting. I was a little more on the fence of like what this is going to look like and how is it going to work out equity wise, but
Yeah.
I'm starting to lean of, I think it may not be millions and millions and you might not be signing, a Nike contract, but I think there's other little things that you can do to market yourself and sort of take advantage of some of those little things, or even thinking about some of our players at MIT, or just some of the other athletes that I've known in the past have made a startup company, or like had an app that, because they were a basketball player, a field hockey player, they couldn't say like Lucia Robinson, member of the field hockey team.
Right.
It was Jane Doe, and there could be, no crossover in, those two realities. And now I just think like, as I came up with an app, I have a startup company, or I have an idea on how to make this product even better, and I can market myself as that person behind the idea, and I don't need to like kind of keep them separate. And so I just appreciate that. I know, especially Division III, you're not getting paid for any of this by the school. You're doing this because you love it. And so being able to have a little bit of those best of both worlds, or even we're seeing so much on social media, just like influencers of like, hey, I went to this coffee shop, or I'm drinking this special water. And I think as long as everything is like on the up and up, and you're taking the right steps, and making sure that you're compliant, I think it can be a really beautiful thing and almost level the playing field. Because I think sometimes too, depending on your background, like maybe you do need to chase that scholarship, and maybe it may not be the best school for you or the best environment, but there's no other way you're going to be able to afford school unless you get the scholarship. And so for someone like that, maybe you can play Division II or Division III without a scholarship and still supplement your education. Especially if you are a pretty good athlete, or you do have a really good social media presence. I think it's a great way for you to kind of have the best of both worlds. Like maybe you can find a place where you're going to have a little bit more balance, maybe at the Division III level, but then and still get to compete at a high level, but then you're also like kind of not sacrificing kind of that payment option.
It's so the whole idea around the limitation with regard to sports is so interesting, because I was just, as you were talking about us creating a startup at school, I remember when I went back to Bentley, I don't know when it was, probably 6 or 7 years ago, and I met this kid who had started in his dorm room. And it was like, the cute story about like, I started this in my parents' garage. I started this in a Bentley dorm room. And like, that was part of his startup story. And the idea that like, you'd have to take yourself out of the mix because you've chosen to compete is like, doesn't make any, I mean, it's the same, doesn't make sense to me that that's any different than any other aspect of aligning yourself with what you're doing in school. And then the other part of it that's so interesting, I was watching, it's so funny you're talking about Wolfpack, because Abby Wambach and Adam Grant, he's an organizational psychologist. They were on the Today Show this morning. I was watching some Olympic stuff, but they were talking about how
Today Show faithful.
Oh, okay, good. I don't remember which hour. I am not, but it was one of the like later hours. And they were talking about how 95% of the top, leaders, business leaders have all been competitive athletes. And it's just so interesting that idea that as an athlete, if you are doing this and embracing like your ability, your motivation to go and make this stuff happen while you're an athlete, that wasn't allowed to exist in the same space. But we also have data that says that you're going to be an incredible leader, but you have to wait till you're done playing sports before you can actually do that really well. It's just such an interesting juxtaposition of like, we have the data that says one thing, but we want to grasp and hold on to monetary power that is happening within school systems. And so it's just so interesting to have just an alternative way that we can actually see how this stuff will play out differently.
Yeah, but right. Like it's like, because I choose to play a sport I love and my roommate's not an athlete, so they get to go do all this stuff, and that's totally fine. But because I'm an athlete, I can't put my name on any of this stuff, like as an investor, as this, as that. Because it can be, misconstrued of like, I'm using my athletic prowess to earn money. And but now it's like, just with, again, the social media influencers and, all of that stuff, and just for basic things that they can get paid for certain clicks of like walking to a certain place, or, saying a certain thing, or like posting once a day, like, give me a break. Like, yes, get paid for that. Again, I think the NCAA and schools are still learning a lot in terms of how to file certain things and, what's permissible, what's not permissible. But I think as they continue to kind of have a loose path and, kind of steps to follow, if you're following those steps, go for it. Like there was, I think I forget where, somewhere in Florida, I want to say the football player, like signed a deal with PetSmart for his dogs. Like, and it's like, what does that have to do with his playing career? Like, yes, I'm sure he got the opportunity because he was an athlete, but it's, and I think there was always the fear of like throwing games and stuff like that, of like playing better or playing worse. But like, PetSmart's going to hook up his dogs with food and like whatever other, commercial sponsorships, or again, like he's going to post a couple of times a day with his dogs and, tag PetSmart or whatever the case is. But like, that, does that mean he's going to play any better or any worse on, college football Saturdays? Probably not. Like, unless his dog has a bad night, he's up all night. Like, just like but, and so I just think like, it's just little opportunities like that you have, like, again, to set up yourself and future generations, and can go down again a rabbit hole of like generational wealth and how that was stripped from so many for so long. And so now like this just changes the game and opportunities. And I think also even at a younger age is going to show people, like, I think schools as part of the NIL should have like a money management or business management investing, like for their college athletes, especially at some of the bigger schools where players are now getting these contracts. And okay, like, let's talk about how to manage your money so that now you may not be going to the NFL. So what are you going to do as soon as you graduate with this money and these investments? And so like, you're not broke at 24.
Right. Yeah. And then, I mean, then you're still part of our family, right? So we can still feel that. Why aren't we supporting ourselves all the way through? The other thing I thought was so interesting, it just pulled back to in my brain when you were talking about this, like the idea that as you're normalizing more women, the more of the firsts, right? So there is all this like anxiety about people being the firsts, and like, oh, if you lose a game, well, no women can coach. That's the game, right? But the same idea came back in my brain when you were saying that, like, this kid getting sponsored by PetSmart, now he's going to be betting against himself in games. It's like, well, if everybody has the opportunity to do that, then it becomes this like microcosm when we have just the firsts and the onlys and the small amount of people that we're saying, oh, all the worst possible things that literally were never in anybody's mind can only happen in that one place. And if they do happen, it reflects on everybody's ability to do and live and compete in the way that they want to do, especially as you're talking about, like, these are people that, when you're talking about D3, you're not going to school to play sports to get paid, right? So you're giving me the opportunity to do that. I've made the decision to have this, my life is a very specific way that I'm having my life. And you're worried that because I'm going to get my coffee paid for, I'm now going to sacrifice the choices that I made to have the balance of life that I wanted to have because I'm sponsoring that wonderful leash that they had at PetSmart.
Yeah.
Now I'm vulnerable.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, it's just, I think some of the, adversaries of it, we're talking, equity and like this and that. And, what about, your Ohio State football player versus, your person that's at, Nichols College playing football. And it's like, okay, like there already is a massive disparity there.
That's
Like there
not the
already is no equity. So, but now like let's level the playing field, because maybe I'm a Division III student athlete, but I'm great at marketing myself. And
Right.
I get out there and I have connections. Or even in smaller sports, like there are sports that have so many, nuanced things that they're a part of that I have no idea about what
Right.
goes into, like, a swimmer, for example. And so maybe there's a special timer that they use that I have no idea about, but maybe they're going to be sponsored by this like special timer, or
Right.
a watch that they use to time their laps when they're like by themselves, or whatever the case is. And so I just think like there's opportunities that, for me, even in more of like a mainstream sport, that I don't know about, of
Right.
all of these other little sports and the things that go into them, and the opportunities that they could have, like, a water polo player, like, I don't know, but maybe, the little like ear things that they
Yeah.
wear, and, maybe they'll get sponsored for that. Like, I have no idea,
Yeah.
but I just think it was too much of like a blanket, like
Right.
equity statement. I think we're on the other side, just limiting opportunities. And I just think there's so many opportunities for growth of even within schools, again, whether it's like financial literacy and managing your
Yeah.
money, or marketing. So now, like, okay,
Yeah.
you want to try to take advantage of the NIL, then here's a course for you. Like, here's
Right.
a way to market yourself. Here's how to put yourself together, and things to look out for, pitfalls to look out for, opportunities to look for. And I just think it's going to be a game changer, hopefully for the better, especially as like rules get narrowed down and
Right.
figured out. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so cool. I was just actually thinking about it. Like, so podcast sponsorships are the same kind of way. When you think about, there are podcasts about everything, right? Like the most minute, like things that feel like so niche that you're like, people listen to this. Well, yeah, the people that are interested in it do listen to it. And if you're selling to those people, that you don't want to necessarily go on like the biggest podcast around, go in there. And so it's like, maybe you only have 500 listeners, but all 500 of those listeners want what you have. So you can, they're highly qualified leads. Yeah. It's just, it's an interesting thought, and it's an interesting avenue to go down. I'm the kind of the business person in me is like, yes, I want to, where's the case study? Oh wait, it hasn't started yet. I don't know yet. But yeah, I think this would be really, really cool. And I think the idea of equity, both as far as opportunity and, the actual way that hopefully there's some transparency. So you have the ability to know that there's actual equity in the way that we're paying people out in sponsorships. But it'll be so interesting to see how it empowers people on a whole bunch of different levels, especially if you're like going to a school that doesn't have business as part of what they're doing, but as part of this suite of how you're approaching this stuff, you actually are having that entire learning experience through something that's completely outside of the school system. Would be such an interesting thing too, because then you would assume that it now brings more nuanced education within the school system that might not necessarily have that as part of their core competency. So it's pretty cool. Oh, wow. Yeah. I could talk about this stuff forever. We had questions and I'm like, I've got more. I want to know all the things.
I know. And there's so much to learn around the corner, but I do think, again, like if we can figure out a compliant way to do it, I do think it's going to be a positive. And I think maybe not right away, but years to come, you're going to see players maybe choosing a different level for the balance, because now, like, they're getting sponsorships to help cover their education and, ways that they can balance that pay scale.
Yeah. And do you think now I'm going to ask all the questions, but do you think it will actually kind of disperse some competitive, like the competition across the board? Because I feel like when everybody's shooting for the same like core group of D1 schools in these particular conferences, it gets the level of competition gets really concentrated in one space. Do you think that it'll start to disperse that a little bit?
I think so. I think it's probably like 5 to 10 years out for it to really like take place, and for players coming even out of high school to understand like the opportunities that they have with this. But
because they're 17, I keep forgetting most of it.
But I mean, I do think there's that shift of, again, that player that was maybe chasing the scholarship because they have to, because they have no other way to pay for college unless it's like perfect grades and a merit scholarship, or they get an athletic scholarship. And now they can maybe kind of have the best of both worlds and have a little bit more of that balance. And
Yeah.
maybe they, instead of shutting out D2 and D3 opportunities, maybe now they even just have the conversation with coaches of like, yeah,
Right.
I'm interested in this, and here are some of the opportunities. And I think it'll just help as coaches get more versed in this as well. They can say, okay, we don't offer scholarships, but some of our players have had success earning money under the NIL.
Yeah.
And so it's going to take time, but I think you'll see players just exploring other markets and other opportunities, because they won't have to just be hyper focused on, one thing or the other.
That's very cool. Nice. Well, we didn't cover family support system. And I have a whole spot in my heart for your people. You've, as a coach, as an athlete as well, but as a coach, you've been parts of different, especially in the last in the last recent few years, you've been parts of different organizations, parts of different families of, you're talking about coaches come in, is this our family? How has that been to kind of navigate all that? And now coming home to your MIT family, how does that all feel? And how has that been to have kind of little pieces of your basketball family all around?
It's a lot.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't have been able to have done half of this and sort of take that leap into full-time coaching and take a pay cut, move, and take some of those chances had it not been for, the family support. Because, and I got a lot of it. I got a lot of kind of naysayers of you're crazy, you're a mom, you're this, you're that, and my favorite, oh, I could never, as a mother, I could never leave my children and blah. But it's if it would have been Mike saying he's got to go away for work for 3 months, it would have been oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
You're fine. And
yeah.
But I just think the family support between Mike and his parents and, my family, and all just kind of stepping in for pickups, drop-offs, and just making things work, while I was gone. And even, when I moved and coming to New York and helping us get adjusted. And now, shifting back to Boston and just knowing that we're going to have, so many friends and family back there to help and to step in, is just a huge part of the process. But again, just makes it special. Like we talked about earlier, Kaya, to be able to grow up in that atmosphere. Even Kellen as a boy, getting to see that, his mom is a sport coach and coaching basketball and doing things at this level. And all of that is, possible. And we're still going to have our family nights and, things like that, and getting to have more of my family back and cheering in the stands. And
yes,
it was always fun to see. And I know they were always excited to come to games. And so just having that, and even now with the kids getting older, it's just going to be really special. The kids were asking the other day, because Kaya remembers the office at MIT, but Kellen was still a baby. And so Kaya was talking about going into the office, and, Kellen's can I go into mommy's office too? And it was yes, you can all come into my office. And
she's I'll show you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. She's like, yeah, I'll show you, and I'll show you the whiteboard. And but I can reach it. You can't reach it. So it's just, it really takes a village, and I'm happy with my village and just the people. And I think too, kind of in one of your questions, it's your family and your chosen family. And
for sure.
I think just more than ever in the last, few years, for, different reasons, it's you really are starting to realize, your chosen family, and who's there and who's not there, and who's going to really be standing in your corner. And I think sometimes that journey can be difficult of figuring out who's going to be there and who's not going to be there. But when you do, it's special. And, our between family, our friend trips that, we do. And I just think it's a special time, and not a lot of people take out the time to do those things and to highlight those relationships. And it's very easy to let life get in the way. But I just think, in the last few years, we found even more purpose and perspective. And I just appreciate sort of the the army that I have.
Yeah. Hey, that's your wolf pack again, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. No, it's the other thing when you were just talking about Kellen, I was like, Kellen's not going to know any different, right? Like the thing we're talking about all these things that are like the world is changing, the society's changing, culture is changing. Kaya and Kellen, like what's happening is just normal for them. Just like growing up. I mean, I always think of people like, what was it like growing up with a Black father and a white mother? I was like, it was my life. I don't know. Like, what do you mean? And so just the idea that they're going to be so much more normalized. Yes, for the athletes on your team that are seeing you like living this life, having a family, biological chosen, having a partner that are like all on board for like what seems so non-traditional, it becomes normal for them. They're like, no, this is what I've experienced. This is more normal now. And having that kind of just play out without the kind of, let me educate you on how this works. It's just like, oh, that's what you've seen. That's what you've been exposed to. It just, to me, is like, I get so excited because it's like, we don't have to do the relearning. We don't have to do the re-education when we are just already showing through just normal every day. We're not being like, look at me, I'm the first, I'm the only. You're just like, all right, let's go to practice today. And that is the learning. It's not some, here's the encyclopedia of the history of it all. It's just, yeah, now you can reach the whiteboard. Isn't that cool? Like that's the exciting point. So
and again, just like continuing to just empower, because too, like I feel like even we're told certain things growing up and like fitting into a box, and you start to break out of that, and it's like you can be anything and blah blah blah, but like you don't always have many role models of like, especially as women, being that you can be anything, you can do this, like you say it. But and so now I just think with some of the women and people that we know, and having Kaya and Kellen like just see people do what they love, and for them growing up to just feel that empowerment to be who they are, do what you want to do, explore different avenues of like not necessarily giving up and jumping from thing to thing, but knowing like, it may take a couple of revisions before you get to the final product, but that's okay. And so just to be in a space that they see that and they know that and feel safe in that is a major part of it too.
I see. I'm just thinking like, so Kaya's like, I've got this uncle who played in the NFL. I've got an aunt who's like who's an NBA coach. Like, what are you talking about? This is weird. This is normal.
Yeah. And it's just like what we do.
Yeah. And it's not that those are the things their jobs are not who they are to me. They are the person who they are. But like, it's right there. That's a job you can choose. What do you mean? It's just like, again, I just get so excited about this stuff because I feel like the fact that like so much of what has been, Lucia, you can only go play this sport as a kid in school. You can only do this, but you have to jump through 5 hoops to get there. And how in one generation, and we're not, from you to your children, how it's like it hurts my brain to think that happened. And I'm like, oh, well, we were the same age. So those kind of things were part of our childhood. But for your kids, they're like, I don't understand. What are you talking about? That's not how we do things. It's so cool to just witness in, a few decades, how that stuff can just completely change themselves. So, well, thank you. Thank you. We could talk forever. I'm just so excited that everyone who listens got to know you a little bit more too. But this was wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on to Checkbox.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, so good. And for anybody listening, if you if you live in Boston and you go to some MIT games, when we get to go back out and celebrate some things, cheer extra loud for Lou. I'm a loud cheerer, so if I'm not there, please cheer loud for me too.
One of the best shows in town, free to get in. So
hey, watch out. And there's also really great food nearby. I mean, come on. Oh, well, thank you. And good luck. When does season start? Let me ask that question. Or when is it supposed to start?
Official first day of practice is October 15th.
Okay. Hey, so that's close. That's so close. All right.
I know. Yeah. I can't wait to get back out there. Students start to move back in. We just made the announcement of like fall is going to be back in action. So fall athletes will come back in like 2 weeks, and then the rest of the students will move in shortly after. So we're hopefully doing well.
Wow. Yes. Yeah. I've got my fingers and toes crossed. It's happening. All right. October 15th, everybody. If you need to start warming up so you can be in shape to be in the stands for November, December timeframe.
Get ready. You got a couple weeks before we start games in November. So get your breathing techniques and your voice ready.
Yes. Warm up, my friends. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Lucia, wonderful. Don't you want to hang out with her? Oh, I feel like I'm so jealous of like all the people that get to hang out with her on a regular basis. If you are in Massachusetts and COVID allows, I really encourage you to go and cheer her MIT basketball team on to victory this coming season. We gave you the dates right at the end here. I hope you enjoyed this. I forgot how much I loved interviewing people, and so I'm so excited the interviews are back. And guess what? We got a treat. Usually it's every other week. I think you can probably expect us to be doing interviews, but next week we're bringing back another interview. So we have an incredible guest next week. And I'm so excited for you to get to know her. But in the meantime, if there's anything that stood out for you or you are like dying to talk about coming out of this episode, go to nikkiinnocent.com/join the conversation and let us know all about what you thought, what you heard. If you think that you or someone you know should be a guest on Checkbox Other, you can do that as well on that join the conversation link and let us know. So I can't wait for you to join us in the next episode, and thanks so much for hanging out with us today.